Welcome to all of our speakers and registrants and delegates to today's webinar, Recycling Content in Plastic Products and Packaging, Standards and Certification. We appreciate the time that you've given to be part and take interest in this subject matter and to be part of today's deliberations. We have 90 minutes scheduled in total for this webinar today, and we hope it to be very, very active. We have a very large number of registrants that will be participating in today's discussion. So we're excited about that. But as a result of that, there will be some logistical control. And so we're keeping all of our delegates on mute. And we ask that they keep their cameras off as well as we go through the presentations. So to start, again, a welcome from the Circular Innovation Council. I thought I'd start by introducing us as your organizational host for today, run through the agenda as a start. We will do our welcome and introductions, tell you a little bit about the Circular Innovation Council, who we were and who we are becoming. And then dive right into the three sets of speakers that we have today. Our friends from the Government of Canada, both Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the Standards Council of Canada, who will open up and talk about the rationale for taking on this work and commissioning this work. Our main researcher and author of the key findings in terms of the standards and certifications we will be covering today as it relates to PCR and on plastic products and packaging from Eunomia, myself, and my colleague Shannon Lavallee, who will join me to talk about our role in the study, which was to take the pulse of the marketplace as it relates to uptake and utilization of PCR. And then we're going to be opening it up for a very, for some time. I think we've protected about 15 to 20 minutes for a group Q&A. So with that in mind, just in terms of format, we're going to be going through each of the speakers individually. We will ask them to come live. They will go through their slide pages, and then we'll protect an hour or pardon me, a minute or two to allow you to ask them individual questions, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. At the end, when we're finished all four, then we will open up all of the cameras and the audio for a group Q&A with the registrants as well. You will see, as is typical in this format, that there is a chat and a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for Zoom. That is where we will ask you to plug in your questions, where we are consolidating them, and we'll be voicing them at the during the Q&A session. I would encourage you to actually add them as they come to mind as opposed to at the end, so that we can collate them and have them ready in a timely fashion. So with that in mind, we will start by introducing you to the Circular Innovation Council. Some of you may know that previously we were called the Recycling Council of Ontario for the better part of four decades. And in that capacity, we were very focused on waste reduction and solid waste in particular, and have evolved our mandate in two ways. We are now looking more broadly at the transition in a Canadian context from a linear economy, and more broadly in that context and holistically at consumption and production cycles, and where we can not only reduce waste, but in fact integrate some of the other environmental and social goals that come with the benefit of a transition towards a circular economy. So in keeping with Canada's recent hosting of the World Circular Economy Forum, we felt that this was timely. And the other sort of big news in terms of this transition as an organization is that we now have a national mandate. So we are still membership based, and if you'd like more information on how to get involved in our organization and its works, we're more than happy to chat to you about that. I think most of you know that in our capacity as and our focus in waste reduction, we do a lot of work in terms of research and certainly bringing together the public and the private sector in terms of identifying solutions and best practices globally and bringing them to a Canadian context. And that's part of obviously what we were doing in terms of being involved in this piece of research. But in plastics in general, we have a variety of different focused works. In 2019, we established the Plastic Action Center. If you had not visited this sort of storefront or global online resource, this is a repository of up-to-date information around the world in terms of plastic waste work as it relates to policy and market developments. So if you haven't visited this research, we welcome you to do that. That's where the recording from this webinar, as well as all of the other research that's being done by our organization and others, rests there. And so we're really about conducting research to identify these market opportunities, either where there's market opportunity or policy opportunity or a combination of both. And so this idea of policy interventions where there's market failure or there's market barrier, that's where we look to affect effective policy interventions, whether it be circular procurement or recycled content mandates, as we are talking about today, or extended producer responsibility. So we are engaging directly in some cases with private sector organizations who are developing waste reduction initiatives or activities on their own front. Lego is a new partner of ours, by way of an example, BMO. So several private organizations who are making their own commitments to reducing plastics waste. They come to us as an organization to support those strategies and activate them. And of course, we are an active partner with Canada's newly formed Plastic Pact. So diving right into the work at hand. Next slide, please. We were going to begin by introducing our first speaker, and just in terms of sort of why we are gathered here today and a bit of background. Of course, this webinar is to present the recently published report commissioned by Standards Council of Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, the title being a comparative assessment of standards and certification schemes for verifying recycled contents in plastic products. The report was authored predominantly by Eunomia Consultant, and we have Sarah with us today, but it was done in partnership with the Circular Innovation Council. And by way of background, and I know my colleague Alex will run you through his slides, but just to refresh everybody sort of what situates us towards this report. The Government of Canada has committed to a target of at least 50% recycled content in plastic products by 2030. And as the government considers actions to support this achievement towards this target, a critical element will be how, of course, to measure and verify recycled content in products to demonstrate how we're going to achieve attainment towards the target. The report itself covers 4 main objectives, which will be the key themes that we cover in today's webinar: a global landscape of standards and certifications for the verification of recycled content claims in plastic products, a comparison of these standards and certifications, insights into stakeholder use and choice of those standards and certification, and then a discussion on future needs related to the verification of recycled content in plastic products. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alex Devonish. He is a science officer with the Plastics Regulatory Affairs Division of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Yuen. As Joanne mentioned, my department, Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, along with the Standards Council of Canada, commissioned this report by Eunomia. From our perspective, the report is important as we look to develop recycled content regulations for plastic products. So you have a couple of slides. Can we start the slideshow, please? So just a little bit of policy overview here. In 2018, Canada put forward the Oceans Plastics Charter at the G7 when they were hosting and when we were hosting. And this, along with the CCME, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, that's the federal provincial initiative, put forward the phase 1 of the action plan for zero plastic waste. This included a target of at least 50% recycled content in plastic products where applicable by 2030. So this is whole of government approach, also provinces, territories, and federal cooperating on this goal. In terms of the federal agenda, our department is proposed to enact recycled content requirements under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And this was announced last year, last October, in a discussion paper, which also outlined actions our government is planning on single-use plastics and some other things like work towards harmonization of recycling programs, extended producer responsibility programs in Canada. So next slide, please. So just in terms of our rationale for establishing these recycled content requirements, obviously we're a long way from an ideal circular economy for plastics. The latest data available shows Canada's recycling rates are quite low, about 9% in 2016 across all plastics. So 90% plus plastics going to landfill, incineration, or litter. This is not an easy problem to solve, and by no means do we think recycled content requirements will solve this on their own, but it is part of a suite of actions under the federal and also Canada-wide agenda for improving the situation and heading towards a circular economy for plastics, which is sorely needed. So one reason and one thing that these requirements could address is the issue of weak end markets. So because there's no stable end markets for the majority of plastic, which is ending up as waste, there's some low end markets for the most part where there are any. So, plastic, lumber, durable items would be a kind of a lower end market. Just not that those products are low end, it's just that they can absorb a lot of contaminants and lower quality plastics, while there's a couple of good limited higher end markets for PET and food grade resins like high density polyethylene. So some of these can be recycled back into packaging, for example, but in general, there's not a very good feedstock available of high quality recycled plastics at a competitive price. And of course, in the current landscape, these are competing with virgin resins or primary resins. By that I mean derived from fossil fuels, new plastics. So the requirements would stimulate demand for recycled plastics, kind of separate the two markets of virgin and recycled resin, and create a kind of consistent demand for recycled plastics. So taking competition out of the game. If there's requirements for recycled plastics, then this will create stable demand, which would expect it to drive investments, expansion of infrastructure, new technologies for collection, sorting, and recycling. Current usage of recycled content is estimated to be low. That's not surprising when only 9% of plastics are recycled. Industry leaders, such as those who are signed on to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's, it's a global initiative towards a number of goals, including recycled content. They reported an 8% average in recycled content in packaging last year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's come a long way from 4% 2 years ago. So it's increasing rapidly, and these companies still do have a long way to go. It could be acknowledged to their goals, which are around, goals vary, but around 25% in packaging by 2025 is a common goal. And of course, there's environmental benefits. Like, why are we doing this? Well, recycled plastics would reduce consumption of primary resources, fossil fuels. It would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and of course, lead to a circular economy, or at least promote it. Next slide, please. And finally, just with regards to this report, because we're not here to really consult on regulations today, we're here to talk about this report. We commissioned this report to understand the landscape of the standards that exist and certification schemes for measuring and verifying recycled content used in North America and Europe primarily. And the report did make some recommendations around how we could in our requirements, what we should be looking to be establishing as minimum requirements that would be necessary to comply with as part of the regulations. So these include, setting clear definitions, defining which chain of custody models and will be allowed or should be allowed, and the details of that. So these are all very well explained in the report, but also things like the recycling or the recycled content calculation point, how to deal with chemical recycling, which is adds some complexity certainly to the measurement side of things, and auditing and compliance requirements. So, for example, is the supply chain being audited? Is that something we want to require as part of our regulations? So these are all things that we are considering as we develop our regulations, and this report has been quite helpful for a lot of reasons. And there's a couple other recommendations like supporting digitization of the supply chain, so with things like digital markers and blockchain, and these are all great recommendations. So with that, looking forward to the rest of the presentation, and thanks for attending.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alex. We're just monitoring the chat and the Q&A functions now. We do have a minute protected. If you've got something specific for Environment and Climate Change Canada, again, as it relates to the findings of this report or their use of it. We're early on. It looks like you're going to get off the hook at this very moment, Alex, but I'm certain that there's going to be comments and questions that come through in the group Q&A. So with that in mind, and again, encouraging everybody to use those Q&A functions, but we will move on to our second speaker with the federal government from Standards Council of Canada. We have Adrienne Yuen. Thank you for being with us, Adrienne. And as I understand it, your title is Sector Specialist, Climate Resilience and Sustainability. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Joanne, and thanks, Alex, for that great context and background. I'll just take a few minutes to talk about the Standards Council of Canada, who we are, what we do, and why we were involved in this project. Next slide, please. So for those who don't know us, SEC is part of the federal government. We are a federal crown corporation under the Innovation, Science, and Economic Development portfolio. Based in Ottawa, our mandate is to promote efficient and effective voluntary standardization. Among other things, we accredit standards development organizations, conformity assessment bodies, laboratories, personnel, verification bodies, and others. We approve national standards of Canada by ensuring that standards development organizations follow a robust and transparent process that balances a variety of interests and geographic representation. And as national standards body, we also facilitate Canada's participation in the development of international standards via ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, and IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. So this ensures that Canada is at the right tables globally, shaping the rules and standards that underpin international trade. Next slide, please. So as Alex already mentioned, the main driving factor for the report that we're discussing today is the target of at least 50% recycled content in plastic products by 2030, and government commitments to introducing recycled content requirements. More specifically, the intent is to inform the development or adoption of a national standard of Canada on measuring and verifying recycled content in plastic products. There are so many calculation methods and approaches out there. So we really needed to do, a scan of the landscape and understand what's needed to create a standardized approach in Canada so that we can have recycled content claims that are verifiable, reliable, and comparable. So this includes consistent definitions of what counts as recycled content, how that content is measured, tracked, and communicated between players in a value chain. This allows us to gain an appreciation of the state of play, understanding why organizations choose certain standards or certifications over others, whether as producers or buyers. So this is a really important step toward ultimately creating confidence in the market for recycled plastics. And a well-scoped standard informed by what is or isn't working today is a really important step forward to driving that demand for recycled plastic. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, we are in the process of finalizing the contract with one of our accredited standards development organizations to launch work on a new national standard and certification protocol in 2022. So I won't go into too much detail because we're, again, still finalizing, but if you or someone from your organization are interested in being considered for the technical committee developing the standard, please get in touch to express your interest. Now is a great time. Next slide. So here are my coordinates. You can also learn more about the work of SCC and the standardization system and kind of how the whole standards world works at scc.ca. That's all from me. Thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Adrienne. I appreciate that. Questions are starting to roll in. So maybe what I'll do is ask Alex to come back live on his camera, and I can run through some of these questions that we're getting in to both of you at the same time, if you're amenable to do so. Adrienne, I guess sort of one of the questions that I had just from the process or the role of creating a national standard for I guess accrediting or verifying the claim that is to come under the mandate. It's a process question, I guess. When a national standard is created, does it effectively set the criteria that would take into account the existing standards that maybe either that we're going to go through today, obviously through the report, that would the standards that you're going to be creating through SCC then recognize those other standards as I guess recognize them that in terms of whether they can meet or exceed the SCC standard? Is that the idea, or would it be a completely separate standard that folks would have to meet independent of these other standards or certifications they may be utilizing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's something that the technical committee developing the national standard will ultimately have to grapple with. Right. So when kind of writing the scope for this project, we made sure, first of all, to reference the Eunomia report. So, everyone who's going to be involved in writing the standard should be reading the Eunomia report, understanding the findings, and understanding, the landscape of existing standards. So the national standard ultimately that we go with will have to be informed by what's working right now. I mean, each of the standards and certifications out there today have their own strengths and weaknesses, right? And moreover, this is an important point, is that the technical committees developing national standards of Canada have to represent a balance of interests. So you'll have producers, you'll have consumers, you'll have regulators, you'll have general interest. And so regulator is one of the hats of the people that will be sitting around the table. So they will also have a voice in saying, well, from a regulator's perspective, this is what we want to see with the standard. And so that will go into the process and be considered as well.
Excellent. That's good clarity. So for those on the line that are using a standard at the moment, considering the use of a standard or certification or own and operate one, they will obviously be interested into ensuring that those that they're employing are relevant to the national standard here in a Canadian context. Thanks for that clarity. Okay, I'm going to whip through a couple of these questions before we get into the deep details of the study itself. And feel free, I know some of these are going to inch towards what will the policy look like. Alex, everybody wants to put you on the spot in terms of what the regulation will look like. You can expect that. Will the minimum recycled content regulation apply only to materials in Canada or also materials being imported?
Yeah, indeed. So unfortunately, there's very little I can share about the regulations which are under development. We are doing some targeted consultations currently and hope to do some more in the new year as we still develop this. We're not looking to imminently publish regulations. It's quite complex, and we do appreciate any kind of feedback or ideas on that. So, the question of imported versus manufactured in general, Canadian regulations, due to trade obligations, we do have to treat imported and domestically manufactured products the same. Sometimes exported products are exempted from regulations. Hopefully that's enough of an answer on that question, at least.
It's a good first start, and I assume throughout the process it'll be asked often. Here is one that may be a little easier and not kind of more policy focused, but it's directed specifically to you, I think, Alex, in terms of sort of situating the 9%. Why have I lost it here in my fold? Oh, here we go. ECCC stated that 9% of plastics are recycled in Canada. Does that number include post-industrial plastic scrap? Scoping question.
Yeah, I would have to go back. I think, the number comes from a report we commissioned from Deloitte in 2019. And as far as I know, it's very difficult to get data on the recycling of post-industrial scrap. I think it's not included because that kind of data is difficult to find. As far as, assumptions, I think there's assumptions in the Deloitte report about, post-industrial resin not being, nearly, as high volume as post-consumer, and post-consumer being really where the biggest interventions are needed. Post-consumer, just to be clear, is from any commercial, industrial, or residential source, as long as someone is using it as an end product. And post-industrial is something that's kind of reused directly in a manufacturing process before it goes to any kind of consumer. It's also known as pre-consumer content. So we don't have as good information on pre-consumer content, but certainly we recognize that it is used as a form of recycled content, and it is addressed in the standards. In the Eunomia report, standards often do measure them differently. Measure them separately. So there should be ways to differentiate those.
So it could come to pass as we develop the standard for Canada that pre-consumed and post-consumed content could be valid in terms of counting towards the target that's set. Conceivable, not there yet. We haven't decided, but it's conceivable that both could count. That's
correct. So it's something that we're considering. Some jurisdictions have gone. There's a few jurisdictions that have enacted recycled content requirements, and in some cases they do allow post-industrial, in some cases they don't. So still under consideration.
Fabulous, that's great. And if I'm not sure if you've got that Deloitte report at your fingertips, Alex, if you could cut and paste the URL. I know I've got some folks behind the scenes here that can also find it as well, but we are getting a question in terms of whether you can share the link to that report. It's also on Plastic Action Center, and it's on the Circular Innovation Council's main website. So we'll make sure that we get that URL up on the chat. And I'm going to just one more question for you, Adrienne, before we get into Sarah's the main feature of today. Are you looking to adopt any international standards coming from the EU, for an example? So just general question on kind of how the existing standards come to play as SCC develops Canada's national standard.
So just a quick clarification that we facilitate the development of standards. So we don't write the standards ourselves. So again, the work will be led by one of our accredited standards development organizations. That's a great question in terms of what about international standards? So I mentioned that, the word adoption in my presentation. Sometimes what a technical committee of experts will decide to do after reviewing the literature and existing standards is actually just adopt a standard from ISO or from another jurisdiction. They may do a straight adoption, no modifications. More likely, they will do some modifications to suit the Canadian context. So that is certainly a possibility.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you to the two of you. We've got more, but we've got limited time as always. To those of you, keep your questions coming. I can see them, they're coming in, and we've got a deluge, which is exactly what we want. If we can't get to your questions through the 90 minutes today, just know that we are noting your question, and we will make sure that between us as presenters that we get a response back to you. And we'll post these Q&As and the responses for everyone's consumption next to the recording on our website as well. So thank you very much to the two of you. I'll ask you to mute yourselves and come off camera. and move into the meat of the report and the main author and our colleague, Sarah Edwards, who's the director of Eunomia North America. Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. I understand you're coming to us live from New York, so it's a pleasure to have you here. And without further ado, if you could take us through your slides, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Alex and Adrienne. Yeah, we're obviously very excited to be working on this project with CIC and for ECCC and Standards Council of Canada. So just want to point out that obviously we completed this study, I think it was probably in June of this year, and there's, as many of you on the call will probably know, there's continuous kind of evolving parts of these standards. And for instance, when we reviewed the standards here, the RMS standard was just in its draft form, and that's now currently live. So there may be some parts in the report that may need adjusting, and if you notice anything in those reports that you would like to comment on, then please just do let us know through Joanne or CIC. So as Joanne said, I'm the director of Eunomia Research and Consulting in North America. I'm going to just run through, if you can move on the slide, please. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to who we are as an organisation, as a consultancy, run through the research, the findings, and some of the considerations that we put into the report. But as just following on from obviously Alex's point, this was kind of effectively a review of standards. Our role wasn't necessarily to inform what might be put in place in terms of any policy or in any standards development. It was about kind of landscape review of what's currently happening in the recycled content for plastics space. Next slide, please. So in terms of Eunomia, we're an international consultancy that's really focuses on waste resource and resource management and the circular economy, and we've been operating for 20 years. The bulk of our work is very much based in Europe, and we're one of the primary advisors to the European Commission. So while myself and my team were reviewing standards on this side of the pond for the Standards Council of Canada, back in the UK, our team is actually doing a much deeper dive into this issue, and we have some more technical specialists that have been really delving into some of the complexities, I suppose, of looking at recycled content. And just to give you an indication, that piece of work that we are doing in Europe is actually an 18-month piece of work, and that is really just to define how the European Commission might consider calculated and verifying recycled content in just single-use plastic bottles as a result of the Single-Use Plastics Directive. So this is a very complex issue that it differs between different product types, and we will touch a little bit on that here, but needless to say, it's not something that can be solved overnight. So yeah, next slide, please. This slide just gives you an overview of the services that we offer. So what is quite unique about Eunomia, I suppose, is that we work with municipalities on the ground, looking at how collection services and systems should be operated to be optimally costed and perform, as well as working on that kind of national level, looking at policy. So we understand how policy affects operations, as well as how to deliver operations within policy, a policy framework. Next slide, please. So just quickly, obviously, we've touched on this, but the objective of the study was to assess the global landscape of standards, specifically as they relate to plastic products, to compare and contrast some of those key factors or differences between the standards, and identify what the future potential needs might be. And, as part of that, what Joanne's team obviously also did was kind of test some of the market realities of using recycled content currently, and where they see some of the challenges going forward. So the broad approach really was we created a long list of standards, not only related to plastics. We looked at other standards for other materials to see at a very high level how they might apply to plastics. We then shortlisted 13 and also reviewed the new ISO, relatively new ISO 22095, which is around mass balance approaching the chain of custody model. We carried out extensive secondary research and carried out interviews as well with some stakeholders across the value chain, from recyclers to chemical companies to some of the standards, current standard operators, to provide that comparison of key components. Next slide, please. So this is just gives you an overview of the standards that we did review. In this presentation, I'm not really going to kind of differentiate so much between the standards that are listed here, but more talk about some of the key themes that we identified as part of the research. Next slide, please. So before diving into some of that, I just really wanted to touch on, or just, I suppose, highlight, and many of you will, on the call will know this, but the very complex nature, I suppose, of the plastic supply chain. Many of us will be familiar, I suppose, with the kind of mechanical recycling process, but what we have to look at in terms of some of these standards, I think, is how a standard can apply to both a material that's fed into the circular economy through that mechanical recycling process, but also be cognizant of new technologies and the chemical or advanced recycling processes that we're beginning to see now that may or may not be able to better manage a wider range or specific polymer types, for instance, like flexible films. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we were looking at the various different standards and certifications, we kind of looked at some of these key components. So we looked at kind of what the material or product was that the certification was looking at, and you know, were there any restrictions in terms of what specific material was being covered by that standard, and in essence, most of the standards we looked at covered a broad range of products and materials. There was only one standard in Europe that was specific to PET bottles, for instance, the RAL standard. We looked at what was being certified, I suppose, in the process. So was it a specific process, or was it the whole supply chain, and how that took place? We obviously looked at the extent to which the standard accommodated, I suppose, the verification of recycled content from both a mechanical and recycling process perspective. And we touched a little bit on we considered the pre and post consumer piece. So I know there's much discussion around how to generate demand for post consumer material, but what I'll come on to in a moment. But we looked at the standards in the whole and the extent to which they considered both pre and post consumer. And then one of the most important points, I suppose, in terms of the verification process is the chain of custody model. That effectively allows the verification process to take place. So, you know, there are different forms of chain of custody model, which is effectively tracking the material through the supply chain, and some of that's linked to a physical movement of material, and it can be physically traced. And when you moved more to looking at chemical recycling, then some of that physical traceability is lost. And so looking at what the type of chains of custody models can be put in place to enable that transparency and traceability to be tracked. So specifically under the chain and custody model and the specific mass balance model, which we looked at kind of where the boundary was of that chain of custody model, the mass balance. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We looked at under mass balance, the differences in the chain of custody in terms of how the system was balanced and the potential for credit transfers between sites and processes to enable to make recycled content claims. And also linked to that is a kind of free allocation of recycled content into a chemical recycling process from the inputs into the outputs. And I'll talk again about that in a moment. Then obviously we looked at how the verification and accreditation took place, so whether there was a need for audits and where those audits took place. And importantly, as Alex said, we kind of considered how the calculation of recycled content took place, where in the process, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a moment as well, and how that happens. And although not in much detail, we do consider in this presentation a little bit around considerations of that calculator in terms of what's included in the denominator and numerator, and the treatment of things like moisture, additives and fillers. And lastly, we looked at how claims and labeling would be considered in each of the certification schemes that we looked at. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of explain a little bit around the chain of custody models that are referred to in many of the standards, and this diagram here is looking at the chain of custody models that are included within that ISO 22095. And as I said before, the kind of definition is of chain of custody, I suppose, is which the process by which the inputs and outputs associated with information are transferred, monitored and controlled as they move through each step of the relevant supply chain. So, you know, when I showed the diagram earlier, it's a very complex supply chain. So you can imagine the need to have good processes in place and documentation to enable that verification through the supply chain. So what this diagram is showing you is that the three different forms, I suppose, of chain of custody model. And as I said, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the mass balance, but effectively on the left-hand side, we have the chain of custody model referred to as segregation. So this is really where there's a direct link between what the inputs are and the outputs. So in this diagram, you can see there's green dots that show the input into a process of recycled content versus virgin, and how that flows through into the output. So in segregation, the virgin material is kept separate effectively from the recycled material, and then so you have either a very pure recycled content output or a virgin output. So there's no mixing of that material. The controlled blending, I suppose, is where you do get material from both the recycling supply chain as well as the virgin into a material, and then there's a kind of blurriness to some degree of what's included in that outbound product. And then the final process, the mass balance, is which we're going to talk through again in a bit more detail, is really where those two materials go into a product, and as a result of the process, is very difficult to understand the known proportions of the outputs that are recycled content. And many times when a mass balance approach is used, there are multiple products that are produced from that process, and so not only do you not know the percentage in one of the products, but the recycled content input could effectively be in multiple output products. So effectively, the traceability of the system decreases as you move further to the right. The strength of claim effectively decreases as the physical attribute of the recycled content is less as you move from the left to the right. Next slide, please. So another consideration when we're looking at recycled content verification, I suppose, and the extent to which a product or a material can have recycled content included in it is related to the boundary of the system for the mass balance. So what this diagram is showing is kind of 3 or 4 different pieces of information, I suppose. So we have 2 boxes here, box A and box B. So and then around that kind of what's called the group level. So we're looking at box A and box B are effectively site level information, and within each site you may have different batches of process of input material producing different products. And in box A, we're showing that effectively the recycled content, very much similar to the previous slide, there's an amount of recycled content coming into the process. That process is then producing an output that has a amount of recycled content that is kind of shared, I suppose, across each of the outputs. And so the exact quantities within each of those outputs are unknown. In product B, the allocation, I suppose, of that recycled content is allocated to a specific output via a kind of free allocation process. So there's a known amount of recycled content and virgin content into the process, and then what the accounting method does is effectively allocate proportionally to what goes into the process the recycled content to one or more of the outputs according to what is in the input. So we're again touch on that in a little bit, but that can work obviously at a site level. It can also work at a much larger kind of group level. So where a facility operator might have several sites, it could look under different standards that the group level, the accounting of recycled content is done effectively at a group level. So in recycled content from one facility could be effectively allocated to an output from another facility, noting that there has to be a chemical link effectively between those processes. Next slide, please. And then this is again just kind of following on from that previous point. So the diagram on the left is looking at proportional representation of the recycled content and virgin input to the outputs, and the second example on the right is where there's a free allocation. So just touching on the proportional representation. So in this diagram, we see that there's 100 units going into a process. 10 of those, or 10% of those, are of recycled material, and the process is producing 3 different outputs and at varying amounts. But the recycled content effectively is proportioned according to those outputs. So product A is 10% of the material that goes into the process goes into effectively to form product A, and that product A has to have 10% of its effectively assigned to it the recycled content of 10%, which is equivalent to the proportional to what was put into the process. And the same for the other 2 products. So that each product has to have the same proportion of recycled content by percentage as what was put into the process. The diagram on the right looks more at the kind of free allocation. So this is where a facility can effectively allocate the recycled content to one specific product. So although there's the same amount of recycled product on the output as the input, it's not proportioned along each of the outputs or the products. It's allocated all to one product. Next slide, please. And finally, a concept that's not actually covered, I don't think, in the ISO standard, but this is, and what we see for some of the standards that we saw, is where one of the outputs from the process is actually a fuel, and effectively then the allocation method does not allow effectively for recycled content that may flow proportionally into the fuel to be allocated into a product, a plastic product output. So this is kind of a split between the free allocation and the other mechanism. So here we see 10% of recycled content going in. The fuel has to contain 10% of that recycled content, but there can be free allocation between the 2 other plastic products or plastic product inputs from the right hand side. Next slide, please. And then just thinking about time, actually, this is also just looking at kind of different methods of allocating the credit from the system. So I won't touch on this too much because I think we're gonna be short of time. So if we can just move on to the next slide, I think that would be useful. And this slide effectively just gives you a little bit of an overview. And again, we didn't go into too much of the detail on this, but we're looking at like how you calculate the recycled content and the numerator, what's included in the numerator and the denominator. I think obviously it's quite easy to consider, the recycled content may be the mass of the recycled material in the product, the numerator, divided by the total mass of that product. But it's where along that supply chain the calculation is made, and to what extent it may consider things that may affect either the numerator or denominator, including items such as fillers and additives, which for some products in some industries, like PVC, for instance, in some of the construction sector, there is a high amount of additives and fillers. So we need to just consider the composition of those materials when we're looking at how to calculate recycled content amount in those products. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the findings, I suppose, going back to that first screen, one of those first screens. So in terms of the scope of material and the point of verification, I mean, as I said before, all of the 13 schemes that we looked at covered or verified all different plastic types. There was only one that was very restricted to a plastic and product type. And the schemes kind of varied in the fact that a number of them verified the kind of process and effectively the resin that was produced from that process. So APR standard, for instance, for mechanically recycled material, very much looking at the process, the recycling process and the resin produced. Whereas other standards looked at kind of the manufactured product, or different elements of the supply chain and the sites involved in the production of that recycled content. 7 out of the 13 schemes that we looked at included for both mechanisms for both mechanical and chemical recycling, so included an approach for mass balance. And all of the standards we looked at, or schemes we looked at, included pre-consumer material, except for 2. And there's obviously a link here in terms of what can be claimed, or the labelling requirements, I suppose, around those 2 elements. But very much pre-consumer was part of the ability to make a claim around the use of recycled content. Next slide, please. All but one, I think, of the schemes we looked at allow for mass balance, and many require the same chain of custody approach across all the supply chain. So if a mass balance approach was used in part of the supply chain, then the whole supply chain effectively had to use the same approach to provide that consistency of documentation and calculation across the supply chain. The system boundaries differed across the schemes, so with some being kind of defined to just a site level, a group level, and this also kind of links into the geographical restrictions as well. So there were some schemes that looked to kind of restrict the boundary and the transfer of credits, I suppose, between the same company within a specific geographical region, for instance. As part of the standards, there's obviously a need for accounting, and in which case the books had to be balanced effectively, and the accounting period ranged across the standards between kind of 3 and 12 months. Next slide, please. And then I touched very briefly earlier on the kind of free allocation method and the ability to kind of allocate recycled content credits, I suppose, to different products. And these are 4 of the standards that we looked at, and they did allow for the allocation of recycled content to be made across products or into a single product. And there were some restrictions, and you can see at the bottom there 3 of those standards listed, all excluded fuels effectively. So fuels were not included. Any recycled content that proportionally would flow into a fuel was not able to be transferred or allocated across to a plastic output. Next slide, please. In terms of verification, most of the schemes required annual auditing by third parties. Some require on-site audits, but most really looked at the review of documentation as a kind of mechanism for verification. And some companies, verified sites in part or whole along the whole supply chain. How recycled content, the measurement method varies. There is consistency really across the standards that we reviewed, that the moisture impurities are kind of not are quite insignificant and do not warrant kind of deductions in the denominator or numerator. But there was some differences in terms of how additives and fillers were dealt with, depending on the scheme. And as I said before, it's quite complex, the use of additives and fillers in different applications. 5 of the schemes in terms of claims and labelling had allowed were based on first meeting a minimum amount of recycled content being present, so 5%, for instance, in our RMS standard, with obviously no maximum. Next slide, please. And in terms of, the claims and labeling, there's, variation across the schemes in terms of how recycled content is in a product is labeled, and the RMS standard seems to have the most extensive range of claims. Thank you, Laura. Associated with labeling to coincide with many different kind of chain of custody models allowed under that program. But also allowing to ensure that content claims cannot be made if a mass balance approach is used. And Laura, forgive me if I've got that incorrect, and update it if needs be. But I think overarchingly, obviously, the primary purpose of the schemes was to, trace and verify the recycled content through the supply chain and ensure that there's the correct documentation to enable that to be done, in some cases using site audits to enable that verification process to take place. But all schemes were reviewed were slightly different, so there is there's no one to go to scheme, and some of the reasons why a scheme was chosen may be dependent to some degree on what other standards or certifications that service provider actually gives to the client. Next slide, please. So we touched a little bit on this, I think, previously with Alex, but kind of looking at future needs and considerations. So, looking at kind of the verification and reporting requirements, or the rules, the kind of minimum requirements. So rather than potentially identifying a standard or a scheme that could be applied with, the standards agency could to set minimum requirements or rules around certain aspects, and then allow those current scheme operators to demonstrate compliance to allow them to certify and verify within Canada. And some of the key areas that we think those rules or system requirements should cover included clear definitions, how the sources of recycled content, so would it be from mechanical or chemical processes, the acceptable chain of custody models, the consideration of mass balance and the complexities under that in terms of the allocation methods and system boundaries and site boundaries and geographies, any auditing requirements, as well as that kind of recycling content calculation method and the point of calculation. I think, next slide, I think that might be my last slide. Yeah.
That is a lot of schematics to get through in one PowerPoint presentation, and in some cases this is rocket science. So thanks very much, Sarah, for doing your absolute best to take a very complex report with a lot of moving parts and to give it to us in 20 minutes or less. In layman's terms, is a feat unto itself. But necessary, and an important summary and a first start to this report in terms of informing the new policy that will come in Canada. And it strikes me that we really have to think through, and I get your reaction to this, that we really have to think through whether we want it doesn't seem to be simpler to verify at the recycling facility level versus at the product level. It sounds like there's complexities to both, mostly because it's a point in time that you're going to be verifying. And at those two levels, it's not static. So, I don't know, I guess in your research to look at the summary of schemes that are out there now, was there more leaning towards the facility level than at a product level in terms of where they verified it?
I mean, as I said, I think a lot of the standards were looking at the whole supply chain and looking at the process. So it wasn't just about a one point in time verification process. So yeah, I think it differed between the programs that we reviewed.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to try to get to some of these questions before I get into the market piece that we took on. I guess it's, yeah, it is a question. Strict mass balance does not allow for credit transfer. Agree?
I don't know. strict mass balance. I mean, I think there's different mass balance accounting approaches. So yeah, I don't know.
May not necessarily be so. And I guess the question, I guess specific to the report, is: do you distinguish between mass balance and essentially book and claim in the report? The second piece of this is recommendations. I don't think you went that far to qualify. I think you stated the facts of what's going on. So did we distinguish between mass balance and book and claim in the report itself? I think
yes, yeah, sorry. I mean, I didn't bring in the book and claim piece, and but we did definitely cover that. It's obviously very different to having a robust mass balance process, and it can get slightly blurred, I suppose, in the respect that if you start getting credit transfers within a company, but between sites, it can start to look a little bit like book and claim, I suppose. So there has to be some guardrails around some of that, and that's what we highlighted in terms of the kind of the boundaries in terms of some of that credit transfer within companies. But we definitely covered the book and claim in the report, just not within the slides.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. And that leads me to go back up to Norm Lee's question earlier, which is this idea: if the mandate, the target mandate is 50%, it's conceivable, and some companies are already doing it, where they're making a claim of using recycled content. It's across a suite of product or a suite of packaging, and it's not dedicated to one product. So his question, and I'm hoping, he says, will the 50% recycled, maybe this is more to Alex, but will the 50% recycled content target be applied to each plastic product, or will it be an average over all of the product that particular brand holder may have, where some products could achieve a lower recycled content as long as the average exceeds the 50%? So, I know you don't want to qualify that now, Alex, but do you have a comment against it at this early stage in the regulatory making process?
No, don't really have a comment. Just kind of, as I mentioned in the chat, it's a consideration for our regulations.
Yeah.
We're going to have to consider which chain of custody model or models would be allowed under the regulations, and we can't really say right now anything really about the targets or how they would be applied to which products and kind of what would be the chain of custody model, unfortunately. But we do want to do. We do plan to do some separate consultations in the winter, and then later on, we don't have an exact date, but perhaps a year and a half would be the time when we publish draft regulations, which of course always do carry a public comment period. So there's still a lot of development underway, and we appreciate comments on that. Although this is not a consultation on the regulations, so.
Fair. I'll keep you both on if you don't mind, just because I think it might sort of bleed into the regulatory making process as well. Under future needs and considerations, so maybe more of a comment. There was no mention of claims. Should a recycled content standard for Canada include guidelines or guardrails around allowable claims? So I don't know, again, maybe Sarah, we'll start with you. Just thinking about the broader Eunomia work in Europe, where they picked off beverage containers as a first go, I would imagine grinding that process that will inform percentages on all other packaging and products if they choose to mandate PCR content as well as there. So is there guidelines and guardrails that are already being developed by the EU Commission to sort of guide this mandate for verification that
there definitely will be. And as I said, that the process that we're going through, looking at the single-use plastic bottles, but also bleeding into the construction and electronics industry, that report.
Oh no, it's so timely when that happens, right? When we ask her a question, she may have done that on. So you're cutting in and out again, so I'm just going to ask you to rewind a little bit.
Okay. Yes, is the answer. Maybe I'll turn my camera off. I think my internet's not
Or
great.
let's try that.
Yeah, so yes, we're looking at that with the European Commission. Our report we'll be looking at specifically on the claims part as well. It's due in spring 2022. And yeah, we're definitely looking that there needs to be consistency in terms of how claims are made and what claims can be made, depending on the chain of custody model really that's applied. And that's something I think, the RMS is the standard that they're kind of got has been quite mindful in terms of what claims can be made. I think that just becomes quite complicated.
Yeah, this is not, there are a lot of moving parts, especially because we've got recycling, domestic and manufacturing.
Especially around kind of labeling, around where you have, yeah, I think my internet's breaking up a little bit. So
yeah, you're cutting out a little bit. Okay, that's great. We'll see if that connectivity gets better. And maybe, Adrienne, you may want to stick out on this with Alex as well, that, the second part to this is, should a recycled content standard for Canada include guidelines and guardrails? And I would imagine any standard making by SCC or otherwise, or subcontracted out to standard bodies, development bodies, comes with some guidelines and guardrails. Is that fair? Alex, go ahead if you want to take that on.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I'll just start. It is another question for consideration that we want to get input on. Is it really important to brands? Is it really important to Canadians to see a certain type of claim like recycled content percentage? Certainly, and we're watching what's happening in other jurisdictions on this, like Europe. It's for regulation. It may not be not 100%. You might need a label. Hard to say at this time. It's certainly something that brands would I assume want to include to promote the sustainability of their own products. Whether or not there's a label, we tend to have a regulatory requirement in place. So there's something to be said about label fatigue as well. There is a lot of information on labels now, but again, can't really talk too much about details, but it's something we'll be seeking input on.
Great. Adrienne, any comments on, is it typical to have guidelines and guardrails that come out with any kind of standard?
Yeah, I would say that that's going to be pretty fundamental. I mean, if you're trying to introduce some rigor to, claims and, how information is communicated along the value chain, yes, you're going to have to put some boundaries on that, and there's going to have to be some rules. So yeah, I'm pretty certain that you'll see something like that coming with the standard.
Yeah, pretty much at the heart of a standard. Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, that's great. So I've got so again, keep the questions coming. Thanks very much to the three of you, and to Sarah. Thank you so much for grinding through all of those graphics and giving us the details of the heart of the report. My job now is just to go through and talk about a little bit about how the respondents to the interviews that the Circular Innovation Council conducted in terms of the use, the attitudes around standards and certifications. And that was our role and our contributions. So what were the perspectives? What's the uptake? Stakeholder input included supplemental discourse on market barriers and readiness. So we were really asking the questions around those two areas for the implementation of recycled content requirement and related legislation. So know that something's coming, this policy is coming down the pipe. Where's the market at? And we didn't just look at packaging. I want to make sure that I say that out loud, that we actually consciously identified non-durable and durable goods. So a non-durable being packaging, but we also recognize that there are many products out there that include plastic. Some of them now actually are using recycled content more so than we actually thought, and just not actually making the claim publicly. So given that diversity, we looked at the suite of products, and we actually looked at the Deloitte report to sort of inform us in terms of, where is plastic waste being generated from what sector. And so we divided it based on lifespan. Interviews were conducted with organizations from across the value chain. So I think, as was said earlier, manufacturers, brand holders, converters, recyclers, the industry associations that help their membership, standard organizations as well, and then as government bodies. So a very wide ranging set of stakeholders to base these interviews and to start to get our thumb on the pulse of the market. Next slide. So from a recycler, resin producer, and converter, this is a summary of the input that we received. Recyclers, resin producers, and converters were more likely to identify that they used third-party standards to certify products they supply to the market. However, this was an exception and not common across the sector. So if they were employing a standard or utilizing it, it was something that included a third party. There were distinct points along the supply chain where certification or verification of post-consumer cycle content was occurring between the recyclers, converters, and brand holders. So again, inconsistencies, different points in time as it relates to the supply chain as well, where it was being applied. The annual maintenance of certification was seen as cost prohibitive. So for many, especially smaller recyclers and manufacturers, were in fact looking to cost as a barrier, and really because they weren't getting a lot of asks from their clients for formal third-party certifications, they were replacing those or utilizing attestations. That became the most common method to verify recycled content use. Most recyclers noted that the majority of their clients do not request formal certification or verification of recyclates. So it's really not has a market presence at this point in time for that sector of the value chain. Next slide. As it relates to brand holders, more formalized reporting processes for calculating, tracking, or verifying recycled content across the suite of packaging or products were lacking or unformalized with most brand holders interviewed. So where they may be utilizing it, there wasn't a lot of rigor internally in terms of tracking it, and certainly wasn't done so for the purposes of externally claiming it. Responsibility for tracking and reporting recycled content was most often assigned to the procurement, supply chain, or sustainability functions, depending on the rationale for measuring progress against a target that the company may have set, or following market dynamics in terms of ensuring consistent supplies. Few brand holders are making public claims at this point in time for recycled content on packaging or products for a variety of reasons, including they wanted some flexibility in terms of adapting to market conditions. So supplies may not be there in terms of recycled content. And certainly they had to navigate this issue of availability of materials, recyclate versus virgin material, and so didn't want to make that claim publicly given those realities. Claims were made against the suite of packaging or products supplied into the market, and therefore the percentage of content in a specific package or product was inconsistent. So going back to, yes, I'm using PCR content, but it is for all of my suite of packaging and products, and so I can't pinpoint the claim at one product level. Next slide. The choice of standards in terms of when asked that question, when they were using them, we asked what were you using and why. So formalized external verification processes were not identified in a majority of sectors interviewed. Where verification of recycled content was used, it was most likely an internal process developed by a part of the procurement process or supply chains function. So again, not very much uptake of third party. Internal processes were, and again, this is a judgment call here, in some cases appeared to be even more stringent than third-party standards currently in use. And given the complexity of supply chains and the diversity of product packaging specifications, it was noted that most internal verification processes that were employed now could address the idiosyncrasies that exist with large consumable and durable product manufacturing process. It was also noted that when third-party verification processes were occurring, it was most likely at the resin production level, not at the product manufacturing point. Next slide. So market realities and barriers, again, high-level summaries based on the interviews we did. Overall, there was limited use or application of third-party certifications or standards that were in the market and available now. Variety of barriers that were identified as a result, the sourcing issues, which we've talked about in several points of today's webinar, supply and quality of post-consumer feedstocks, the cost increases comparatively to virgin resins, one linked to the aforementioned, production interruptions to try to integrate and protect time and space to integrate post-consumer recycled feedstocks, product performance or perceived product performance quality. And that was actually most interesting as it relates to either packaging, which had food applications for obvious reasons, but also in the durable goods, where they felt that the consumer might see that having recycled content would mean lower quality. Ability to meet design specifications, regulatory or health or safety requirements, or maybe a lack of understanding in some arenas where they weren't sure what the requirements meant in terms of utilizing PCR content. And then again, looping back to consumer perception and satisfaction of a good or package if it was made from post-consume feedstock. Next slide. Continuing on with market realities and barriers, recycled content in durable plastics good was indicated was limited. So, overall limited, but in particular with durable goods, uptake was most common where brand holders or retailers had made public commitments or targets, no shocker there. And recycled content use in some consumer goods were not publicly promoted. So we had companies making commitments that then had to follow up with their claim, and we're tracking it through these attestations. And then somewhere you're actually seeing post-consumer goods utilized and not promoted at all. Recycled content inputs were often treated as virgin inputs and not tracked against any targets. And where recycled content was being integrated in the production of durable goods in particular, interestingly, the resin types were predominantly LDPE, PET, and some polypropylene resin types as well. So interesting to note which of the 7 resins is most commonly being used. And where recycled content was used in the packaging sector, it was often at a higher cost. Despite this, it was rationalized again to fill a corporate commitment that was activated through supply chain procurement. Next slide. In terms of future considerations, given our small and short, narrow inventory of where the market's at, there are significant variations in PCR plastic content use between durable and consumable goods and between resin types. So therefore, one of the conclusions we're drawing is that this mandate, it really needs to be examined at a macro level. So not singling out packaging versus products, that in fact, you're supporting a broader market sharing of plastic resins and opportunities to utilize more of the 7 resins if you are applying the mandate to both durable and non-durable goods. And so we felt that was a key consideration. Increasing PCR use across all plastic packaging and product applications will likely need to be considered as a staged or phased approach to scale up, and we have to balance this with obviously the technical and mechanical availability of the recycling industry to catch up, and so some need there in terms of ensuring that the supply is there, but also we need time to develop the standards given the complexity of the issue. This will allow for time for pilots and trials and provide support for the industry sector to or applications that deal with conflicting or competing regulatory dynamics. So, this information back to Alex and his team in the policy making, our aim is 50% by 2030. Ratcheting that up is probably a safe and logical approach to the policy. Recyclers express a willingness to make investments in their own infrastructure to meet the increased supply, but they really need and to deliver the quality standards that are expected, but they need those thresholds with hard commitments in order to compete with low virgin resin pricing. And we heard that in spades over and over again. So some interesting summary of those considerations as well. Next slide, and I believe that's coming to the end of our again, small. So we've got a little bit of time yet, about 10 minutes left for questions and answers. They're still coming in. So if I could ask everybody to go live, that would be good. Okay, so I see some comments. And I'm going to try to just pull out the questions if you bear with me. Okay. And this is just a free-for-all. It's a rapid round. We have seen some countries banning products made with recycling content, I think is what's meant there. It says contract, but I think you mean content. Do you foresee more countries following suit? Or do you think such countries will change left the ban instead and go to the ban instead? So I'm not sure if it's fair to ask our policymakers that. I think that's a question where, you know, I think the ban thus far, especially, and I don't, in a Canadian context, is really focused on single use. That doesn't prevent recycled content in those single use items at this point in time for sure. But Alex, do you want to comment on this at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly safety concerns around recycled content. Certainly, recycled content coming from certain streams, automotive, e-waste, but we're not, you know, at this time, you know, there are some types of plastic due to the content of certain chemicals that really can't be recycled. And in fact, I believe even is illegal to recycle if it contains certain chemicals which are now banned. But this is not really an issue so much for single use and packaging products and a lot of other products in different sectors where it's, you know, recycled content can be safely and demonstratively used in a lot of different products. So no, like Canada has no immediate plans to ban, you know, recycled content, along with, you know, requiring recycled content in certain products. But, you know, with a caveat, that there is some types of plastics that have to be destroyed because they do contain now banned products that can't be allowed to recirculate on the market. I'm not an expert in this, but it's something that you know, my department is expert in and, you know, can find more information about. But I think we have pretty robust and safe overall recycling system in Canada. This may not be the case for some other countries where safety concerns are kind of harder to address.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Does the report identify standards that follow the book and claim chain of custody model, or more generally, does it categorize the standards by chain of custody model? Do you want to try to stick onto that, Sarah?
So within the report, there's an appendix. The appendix has a table that lists all of the standards or certifications and a kind of much broader list of some of the criteria or key components that we looked at. And so that clearly states which, if they're using different chain of custody models within that. So yeah, that's included in the report.
Thank you for that. I'm going to put you on the spot, Sarah, because you just do so well when I do that. And this is a judgment call, just given your level of expertise and learnings from the work that you did with this study and others. Do you have an opinion of where in the supply chain a standard or certification process is best to be mandated, or we won't quote you, even though it's being recorded, we won't quote you, we wanted to read this back to Eunomia, but you know, is it with the recyclers, the converters, the brand holders? Like at what point, you know, given that we have a duty of care here to verify, that's the whole point. Is there a place?
I can't comment on that, because I think you have to understand, you have to do a bit more due diligence on where the most appropriate point is, and where at that point is the cost for the verification, where it's going to be the most accurate, what products it's flowing through to. It may be different for different products. You know, this is the kind of in-depth analysis that our teams are doing in Europe.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
haven't got enough knowledge to make that comment.
Here, I'll come back to you in a year's time when you're done the 18-month study. I will come back to you and ask that question. But I guess at the end of the day, we're going to have a Canadian standard that's going to have to be followed. And given that, in our stakeholder interviews, we did see quite a few attestations, which we were a bit shocked, especially those that are making claims that are trying to integrate more and more of it. They were, as we mentioned in my slides, more rigorous in some cases. Adrienne, are you assuming, again, I'm putting you on the spot, are you assuming that the national standard will have criteria? And again, it could be a third-party certification or a standard used elsewhere or existing that could meet those criteria. Could it come to pass that, in fact, an internal attestation, as long as it meets those criteria, would be sufficient?
That it's an option. Yeah, that's a detail that will have to be worked out by the experts developing the standard.
So a call out to, I know there's some brand holders on the line here that I know are using internal attestations. I mean, I think it's within your interest to make sure that that Adrienne and team and the subcontracted standards organization that will be helping develop that standard is aware of what those attestations look like and what's part of them to inform those criteria. So, really important call out to those folks. We're getting to the tail end. We're in the last 4 minutes. We've got a slide just so we can, maybe Cedric, if I could ask you put up that slide. I don't know if it interrupts our screens here, but just the URLs to where this recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be situated. We are gathering up the last of the communications here. And just before we close off and get to the housekeeping for webinars in the 2022 season for Circular Innovation Council, just want to thank the three of you very, very, very much for taking the time to be with us today and to be so generous with your time and expertise and forward thinkingness. Now your name is in lights and everybody has your email addresses. So we encourage, of course, and I think you all welcome questions, comments from the delegates to get in touch after this webinar. So on behalf of the Circular Innovation Council, we thank you very much. And we look forward to continually working with you on this important policy mandate. And for those of you who are still with us, we are continuing our 2022 webinar series on post-consumer recycled content. Here are the key themes. We haven't picked dates yet, but we will be certainly socializing these webinar subjects with you, continuing on digging into the market realities in all of the categories that we touched on for this subject and more. And we hope to actually bring forward some of representatives in these various sectors so that they themselves can talk about what they're doing around preparing for what is to come in terms of PCR mandates. We want to do some snapshots on the global policy and regulatory developments that are happening stateside and also in Europe as they're bringing forward and implementing their mandates so that we can inform the direction that Canada will be taking. And then this whole idea of market readiness again, what are those barriers and technical opportunities, and assuming that some of the processes like chemical recycling will be farther along and we can plug them into that conversation. So look for these webinars. And again, all of this information, next slide, please, will be part of our two websites, the Plastic Action Center and Circular Innovation Council. And with that, we'll give everybody else back their afternoon. Again, thank you very much for the delegates for being with us today and showing your interest. And again, to all of the speakers, we really, really appreciate your time. Take good care. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.